Hi, I'm Debbie Georgatos. Welcome to my show, America, Can We Talk? Today, we're going to talk about contact tracing, selective, ineffective surveillance. Senator Bob Hall joins me on contact tracing and questions of privacy and freedom, the Bolton book battle, and finally, anti-Americanism and immigration. And of course, I'll tell you why these stories matter to you. Stay tuned.
Debbie Georgatos, host of America Can We Talk, is an author, attorney, and political analyst whose mission is to inspire the American political conversation about preserving liberty in the best country on earth. America Can We Talk is sponsored by GC Works, a Dallas-based company performing advanced technology research in the oil and gas industry.
And welcome again to America Can We Talk and to today's First Five. I'm Debbie Georgatos. Much conversation is happening around the country about contact tracing, the idea that we all need to be subject to government surveillance at some level in order to prevent the growing spread of the coronavirus or COVID-19. Contact tracing is a system which essentially involves the government in one way or another figuring out who you've been near, have you been exposed, with whom have you been in contact, and kind of creating like a spider's web of tentacles going out, connecting, helping them track down everyone you've been in touch with, all with the supposed purpose of making sure we are aware of the spread and we are asking people who may have been exposed to coronavirus to quarantine themselves for 14 days. We've talked about it in the show before. I'll tell you one time on the show, during the show, a doctor friend of mine called me during the show and then texted me a message, said, "You've got to text me, call me as soon as we're done." Her basic point, this is a medical doctor here in North Texas. She was making the point that even with HIV and AIDS, other diseases where we have engaged in contact tracing, trying to prevent the spread of HIV, so they're trying to figure out what kind of contacts people have had, even in that, her point was, is very difficult. People don't comply. They don't want to have the invasion of their privacy, so it doesn't even work that well with HIV. But her point about using contact tracing with respect to the coronavirus is this is an airborne virus. It is literally, in her description, impossible for contact tracing to work effectively because it's spread in the air. And so you could be tested today and the very next day, or 2 hours after your test has been completed, come into contact in the air, not know you're carrying it, utterly ineffective, and especially because it's airborne. She will be joining us in the show soon to describe more fully why contact tracing is a fool's errand with respect to the coronavirus. I want to mention those first five, though, other kinds of astonishing hypocrisy. One is, you likely saw that as the protesters in this country, or I try not to call them protesters, the rioters, looters, arsonists, and mob that just wreaked havoc on American cities in the last few weeks, all of them were out in cities, hardly any of them wearing masks and certainly not socially distancing. So those people who were out, truly, in big crowds, no kind of control at all. There was a statement put out by political and health leaders, and this was reported and touted as a sign of bravery and moral virtue. Medical doctors actually signed on to a statement saying that, yes, of course we have to continue preventing, we have to continue insisting on social distancing, we have to continue having people stay apart and wear masks, except of course if you're out protesting the death of George Floyd. In that case, the overriding health concern is making sure you get to protest without limitations of social distancing. Other amazing things, or the hypocrisy of it all, there was in New York City, Mayor de Blasio truly said, we are going to push. In fact, he began the contact tracing in New York City May 8th, and he had a spokesman announce that as they are doing contact tracing and they find someone who tests positive, so the next question in every contact tracing episode is, so where have you been? Who do you live with? Who have you been around in the last, whatever the time period they say? But the contact tracing team in New York City was specifically instructed by Mayor de Blasio, do not ask them if they've been part of the George Floyd protests. This, my friends, is not science. It's not science if you overlay this allegedly scientific effort to gather information of who has come into contact with a political mission that you happen to support. So the utter hypocrisy, just darn crazy. Last thing, Axios Ipsos did a big study saying that most Americans are, in their term, highly resistant to COVID-19 contact tracing. Really, really don't like the idea of contact tracing, especially if it is mandatory. So the upshot of this one study was, well, let's make it voluntary then. Allow me to tell you what happened in Kansas. So in Kansas, they tried. During this coronavirus outbreak, they had one community, they put in contact tracing mandatory. And it was an utter, complete flop failure. People would not cooperate. They just would not play the game. So then 2 weeks later, they have a new proposal in Kansas. It's voluntary. Sure would love if you would do it, but it's voluntary. And, I'll tell you folks, my personal sense of government surveillance, intrusion, following Americans around, being too aware of everything we do in our lives, it's bad enough before coronavirus came along. But the idea of the government engaging in contact tracing of American citizens for who knows how long and who knows how intrusively, this is not going to play well in Peoria or actually anywhere in America. And that, my friends, is today's First Five. As I mentioned at the start of the show, we have a guest in studio. We have Senator Bob Hall, Texas State Senator Bob Hall. He represents the Senate SD, Senatorial District 2 here in the great state of Texas. He is a favorite among conservatives around the state because he is always willing to stand up and speak up for what he believes in, kind of regardless what's politically trendy or acceptable. He stands up for what is right, and the conservatives, for that reason, simply appreciate him so very much. I asked him to join me in the studio today because I want to talk about what is happening in contact tracing in Texas, why there is great opposition in Texas. I want to dive in deeply and talk about why people oppose, what would be involved, first of all, why people are so opposed to it, what are the reasons it's of concern, and then to find out his other thoughts about what we need to do politically to perhaps resist contact tracing. So without further ado, welcome to Senator Hall.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it very, very much. This is an issue that is of great concern, not just to me, but to all liberty-loving Texans and Americans. Because it's not just here in Texas, but that's the one where we have a concern for it.
It is. I want to have you just tell us. So tell us what the basic system is. In Texas, by the way, if you lost track of this, Republican majority. We have Republican governor, Republican leadership, Republican majority, House and Senate. So you can't even blame the Democrats for this. Tell us what the system is that's being proposed or is actually beginning to be in place in Texas.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say that it is not the government's responsibility to protect our health. Our government's responsibility is to protect our liberties. And just because you have the right to do something doesn't make it the right thing to do. And there is never, ever the right time or the right way to do the wrong thing. And contact tracing fits that perfectly, because contact tracing that's kind of the new name. It was called contact tracking, but they did a poll and people didn't like being tracked. But they did another poll and it was okay to be traced. And so they decided to rename it as tracing. But the concept, it's been with us for a long time. It was first introduced back in the early 1900s when that's how they found Typhoid Mary, who was running around the country and they couldn't figure out what it was. Well, that's how and it has a place. It has a place when you are trying to corral things like Ebola, TB, HIV, STDs, things that are very deadly but move very slow and are not highly contagious. None of those are. And so it makes sense to try to box that in and you can stop it. But what we now know, and I say now know because, as you well know, this all started with the government and the media misleading us with bad information about how deadly the virus was and how we would be overwhelmed in our hospitals. I think they were predicting that Texas would have 240,000 people dead by August, which means we'd have about 100,000 dead by now. People would be dying in the streets.
In the whole country, yeah.
No, in Texas. No, the prediction was for Texas.
Okay.
And no,
Wow.
huge numbers. But what we've realized is, as of last week, I believe, unfortunately, and every death is serious, but we had about 1,500 that had died. But in the same time frame, we had 7,500 die of the flu. And so,
Wait, I have to stop. In Texas,
in Texas,
1,500 died of COVID-19,
Yes.
7,500 of the flu.
that's right, and or more, because it's not a reportable death. That's an estimate.
Wow.
Because it's not reportable. I think we've had about that many die of a heart attack also. So the point is,
Wow.
and this is something to get to a little bit of the background of why I was so concerned. Both Jefferson and Hamilton talked in Federalist 1 and 2 about government and the trade-off between liberty on one end of the spectrum and government security on the other end. And we'd always have that battle, and there'll be those folks who tend to want to have all their security come from the government, and those who would prefer liberty and make their own decisions. And so my perspective is from the liberty end, that the government's role, as I said, is to protect our liberties, not to protect our health. And so with this, starting when they scared everybody, the whole objective was to scare people to death. They were projecting
Yes.
a 7% death rate. We're now finding that it's somewhere around 0.26, between 0.4 and 0.26.
Under 1%.
Well under one,
Well
way
under
under
one,
1%.
Yeah.
And we also led us to believe that it was an equal opportunity virus. That is, it didn't matter your age, your race, or anything about you, it would attack equally to everyone. But we now know that's not true. Matter of fact, none of what they said in the beginning is true. And being with my military background, I kind of refer to things from like we experience in the military. Battle plans are made by a staff that have nothing to do with actually fighting the battle. But when you go into battle, you've got a plan, but once the first shot is fired, if the battle commander doesn't adapt to the enemy's tactics and firepower, he's going to get beat. And that's what we have failed to do. We are still operating
really
today as though this is something that's going to kill everybody equally, and that it has a very high death rate. And so what we need to do is adjust what we're doing to what the threat really is. And what we're finding is that 80% of the people that have died are over 60 years old. And most of those have had an underlying condition such as diabetes, hypertension, obesity, something to have excessive sugar in their system. Those under 20, less than 1%. Which means it makes no sense at all for us to have our schools closed at all. And we need to address the nursing homes. In Texas, at least 50% of the deaths are in our nursing homes. And I say at least 50% because that's the recorded number. What I did find is that if a person is in a nursing home and gets transported to the hospital and dies, it doesn't count as a nursing home death. And so it's even greater.
Oh, okay.
So we need to have our focus where the problem is, not causing businesses and people and others that are in a low risk. What we need to be doing is telling people this is what the facts are. Now, you make your decision on what risk you're willing to take in this. But the contact tracing in this program, as you said, makes absolutely no sense at all. This is kind of like it's like trying to bail a boat out with a sieve. The sieve has a good purpose in sifting flour, but it makes a terrible bucket for bailing water out of a boat. And that's what we have with contact tracing. Primarily, it would have made a little bit of sense if we had instituted this on day one back in February or January at that time. Today, because of the asymptomatic folks out there, which nobody knew anything about that when it began. Asymptomatic, for those known, those people that have it that don't even know they have it, or they don't get sick, or they don't have symptoms that are enough for them to think is something other than they just kind of feel bad. But a huge number don't have any, but they are spreading it just like everyone else is. that does. So if we talk about this contact tracing, it's done when someone goes and gets a test conducted. The lab determines, oh, they tested positive. And so they will be contacting the contacting center in the government, who will then call the person to then interrogate them on where they've been, who they've been around, what they've been doing, and tell them about their need to isolate or quarantine. And there is a difference within our government on what the level of so-called volunteer is. The governor has said that it's all voluntary.
Our governor in Texas.
Our governor has said it's voluntary, but when I talk to the people that are in the government that are going to be implemented, their interpretation is that it's voluntary so long as the people volunteer. And if they don't volunteer, then it will become mandatory.
Right.
And it's just kind of like what we're just now seeing is that we're not going to put people in jail for not wearing a mask. But now we're going to put businesses out of business if they allow people to come into their business not wearing a mask.
I should jump in. I want to mention that because I haven't mentioned on the show before. We were talking about before we get started today. But today, in our great state of Texas, we have the governor who's been kind of surprisingly oppressive in terms of dealing with the spread of coronavirus and COVID-19. I've contrasted several times with his conduct with the conduct of Governor Kristi Noem as one example in South Dakota, far more respectful of the individual right to freedom. But back to Texas, Governor Abbott today, there was actually a letter, you may have seen this, Senator Hall, but there was a letter from, I think it was 9 mayors asking Governor Abbott, would you please, Governor Abbott, order people to wear masks. Give us authority to punish them if they won't wear masks. Governor Abbott said, well, I can't do that, but you mayors, you could order that businesses in your jurisdiction, your businesses must require a mask of people entering, or you can punish the business. And so the whole idea of, so he's essentially saying, yeah, I can, in this kind of, I can run around the problem, sidestep the problem, but eventually the notion is forcing people to wear masks, which is just the whole government coercion point I want to get to. But I want to have you finish describing, though, how contact tracing works. So you have a test. So what if you just refuse to have a test? Then they can't.
Well, if you don't have a test, and the point most people understand is the big push for testing is questionable even in itself, because that test is only good for the moment you take the test. You could contract the virus before you even get home that night. But let's say you tested, we still have a huge number of false positives and false negatives, so it's even questionable how valid those tests are. But if you do test positive, then they're going to contact the tracking center. The center is going to call you and then ask you, where have you been, who have you been around, where'd you go, and what did you do, and so on. And oh, by the way, you're going to need to quarantine. And that's 2 parts. So let me talk about the first. Okay, where have you been and what have you done? If you ask the average person where they've been, they're going to say, well, I think maybe I may have had lunch at a Chili's restaurant on Monday, or no, did I go to the library on Tuesday, or was it Wednesday? I went to the library. Not sure where they're going. I said, how is that going to be of any value? Oh, well, this is what I was told by the word, and I'm not reading this on Facebook. I'm getting this directly from the people that work in our state government that told me, oh, well, we will have the businesses keep a log of who's in there at what time and where they sat. And that's been confirmed now, because I've had several people call me and tell me, I went to a such and such restaurant and they demanded that I provide my driver's license to them so they could record my name and address and phone number.
It's actually happening in Texas. Wow.
It happening right here in Dallas, and it happened in Austin, and I don't know where else the other people were, and asking me about this. And I've tracked it down to where I believe this direct order was coming from the mayors, which concerns me a great deal. Of now we have mayors enforcing law that's never been passed by our legislature. We have laws, that's a whole nother subject in the thing. But the point is, we're talking about the only way they'll be able to do this is if they keep a log of the people of where they were, so they can then contact them. And when I ask them, well, it's voluntary, when they say, yeah, they can hang up on us, they don't have to answer. And I said, okay, that's okay, volunteer on that first person, but how did Jane Brown or Joe Smith that happened to be in the restaurant the person went to, when they get the phone call, how did they volunteer their name to now be in a database and into a system in this thing? And that's when I don't get an answer for that piece of it.
And so that piece of it, so say you're the one they call and say, hey, you know, you were at such and such restaurant and 6 feet away from you or less was so-and-so, and so what if you respond? Are you also at that point to say, I don't really want to talk to you, I'm not going to answer you, or can you hang up?
Yes, that's what I'm told you can do. But what I found already, I've already had constituents call me and said that I went and got a test and the test came back negative. And then they called and told me that their test was questionable. I need to come back in to be retested, but I didn't want to do that. So they called my employer and told them that I had been in there for it and what had happened, and he should not allow me back into work until I went back and got the test.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, this is not stuff I've read on the internet. This is people calling me that I got it in writing from them that they actually did this to them. So my concern are these rogue mayors and rogue, and it's not all of them. We have a lot of really good mayors, but it only takes a few that all of a sudden have the power. We saw it in one of the counties, you recall, where the mayor was wanted to have a couple arrested because both the husband and wife went to Walmart, and he said only one of them needed to go to Walmart at a time.
Yep.
That kind of silly nonsense of people get drunk with power and doing that. But let me get on to, before we run out of time, over where it gets really kind of hairy, is the side of, okay, you've got it, now we need the isolation or the quarantine side of it. And they said, well, when we talk to the folks, we're not going to ask personal information like their bank account or stuff like that, but we are going to want to know their living conditions. Like it concerned if it's a family of 5 living in a small two-bedroom house, maybe has some small kids in it, or an elderly person where they're not going to be in one bathroom, they're not going to be able to quarantine or isolate in the house, then we're going to have government housing available for either the elderly person, the kids to go into, or something that, you know, not being specific about who would have to leave the house, but we would have, and I asked a question, I said, now this is voluntary? And the answer I got is, well, we would hope they would volunteer. And I said, does that mean it would be required? And said, well, we can do that. And I said, where in the world do you think you have the power to do that?
Yes.
And this is where the shocker came. We already have it in law. We have it under the Contagious Disease Act that our local health officials can require the quarantine of someone if they feel that they have a contagious disease. So that exists already, and as I said I remember that is correct, and it is a valuable tool when you have something like Ebola or someone who goes out and purposely is trying to infect other people. It has a place, but it does not have a place here in this. Now the other side is other people within the government, I've been told we would never do that. We would never use that. It is going to be all voluntary. I just have a concern that when we have things like we just talked about of the mask issue, when we get into this and people aren't volunteering, that the next step is going to be to make it mandatory. But the bottom line is, when I also asked the question, okay, we kept talking about the things we were going to do because we wanted to flatten the curve.
Yeah.
Now, most people didn't understand, flatten the curve does not reduce the number of deaths. It just spreads the deaths out over a longer period of time.
So you have hospital beds available.
So they had hospital.
Yeah.
Well, we have stayed well under 2%, maybe just went over 2% of our hospital capacity. And of course, we prevented thousands and thousands of Texans from getting needed medical care like breast cancer surgery and knee surgery and prostate cancer surgery, while hospitals sat empty or closed or laid people off while we were waiting for the COVID patients who never showed up. And we're yet going to have to pay the huge price, those people are, of not getting that medical service when they needed it. It is going to catch up with us. But I am concerned that we will, lose sight of what we're supposed to. The bottom I was getting to is when I said, okay, how many deaths is this going to prevent by doing this? So what are the metrics? How do we know that 4,000 people spending $300 million with a company that's never had a contract bigger than $2 million? How many deaths is that going to prevent? Well, we don't look at it that way. We just look at it as it's something we should be doing. And then I kept trying to get back to the metrics. I'm an engineer, so I measure things that if you can't measure it, you don't know whether you're accomplishing anything or not.
I was going to mention for our listeners, the 300 million number comes because in Texas, the government happened to contract with a company named MTX for $300 million to put the whole contact tracing system in place. They're the ones who are in charge of it all. It was an expenditure, never went through the legislature, and there are people questioning whether that should have had more of legislative input, even if it was money available for emergency funding.
That is correct, and that's just a portion of the money. We now have several agencies. As of 2 weeks ago, the number that we had hired was something like a little over 2,800 people were involved from Texas A&M, University of Texas, something called AmeriCorps, and 4 or 5 other groups that we issue contracts that are in the millions, tens of millions of dollars for them, in addition to what we're doing with this contractor, which is highly questionable about them, and it's highly questionable about how they got the contract. Because they have never done anything like this before. They had less than 200 employees, most of which were in Bangladesh, and they were at the same time taking on contracts for similar work with 16 other states, which means if they do similar there what they're doing here, they would have to have an employee increase in a month's time of over 38,000%. And I can't imagine any company being capable of building up like that or doing something. And the big concern with them is all the private personal data of individuals that are being tracked and where they're going and what they're doing and their history is going to be on computers that we have absolutely no control over.
But hackers will.
Yeah, I mean, the state cannot even protect its highly sensitive computers within the state, and now we're going to have individuals and companies involved in this that we have no idea what they're doing or how they're doing it, but they will have individuals' private data that nobody should have.
Okay, I want to do a top-level summary of the kind of concerns so far you've raised about contact tracing, because it's a massive topic. But number one is that there is a seeming willingness of the government to, or assertion of authority that they can impose quarantine on people, and if people do not seem to be cooperating, unclear, they're talking about having the authority to take people out of their homes. You've been told to quarantine because you were at Joe Blow restaurant and you came in contact with someone. They could remove either the grandmother, the children, or the person who's quarantining. So it's a forced thing there. You're describing unjustified based on the actual death rate as compared with other extreme diseases. I mean, the death rate, we all were duped really by the data that came from that Dr. Neil Ferguson. It wasn't Oxford, Imperial College London, that had the dramatic predictions about death rates, and so everyone jumped into high gear. We've now had within 2 or 3 weeks, we realized the data was completely incorrect. No one's adjusted the battle plan to the facts on the ground. So we're still responding to bad data from the beginning, and contact tracing is all about the idea of limiting the spread, but now they're saying they can't really calculate what numbers, your last point, they can't really calculate the numbers of people who would be protected by the use of contact tracing.
And particularly since it doesn't make any sense, understanding that the only people who will be able to track are those who go get tested and test positive, and for each one of those there may be a dozen or 2 dozen people that are asymptomatic that are out there spreading it. And so it's like we got 20 people out there spreading it, but we're going to spend time and money and think we're doing something meaningful tracking one person out of it.
Yeah. So we have, in fact, that was one point that I made a few weeks ago, and it really dawned on me, like in the middle of talking about all of this, unless you make it 100% mandatory, it's pointless. It can't work. You either have to make everybody comply and everyone gets tested, or there's no purpose to it at all.
No, but what more important, Debbie, is what our government ought to be doing is providing the information about who is susceptible, how it's spread, what you can do to protect yourself, and let the people make their own decisions on what level of risk they're willing to take. It's like they do every day. Somebody gets up in the morning, they make a decision on the risk they're going to take in getting in their car and going somewhere. Like coming over here, there were people who will take the interstate, the freeway, to come over here. There are others who will come on the side roads because they don't like they think it's too much of a risk for a wreck. They make a risk decision. Everybody makes that decision, and that's what we ought to be doing. That's called liberty.
So it's the foundational principle. I'm completely in agreement. The foundational principle of liberty, people make their own decisions. The government's job is to inform you so you understand the data. And actually, for people who are particularly susceptible, if you're being told that by the government, you understand, and you say, you know what, I may have underlying conditions, I may be vulnerable, but I still would rather go out and live my life. You're allowed to make that choice. That's a choice you can make at liberty. You can. But so, okay, so say we agree it has limited efficacy, this contact tracing. But what's the... I mean, and it's really, I mean, polling is showing this. It's Republicans, conservatives who don't like contact tracing, and Democrats more willing to go, well, okay, if that's what they have to do, it's fine with us.
Actually, there are Democrats that are just
there
as opposed. Yes, there are.
I'm just saying polling saying that. But go ahead.
No, there are Democrats that have expressed a great deal of concern about this being somehow used against people that by the government.
That's what I want to turn to then. So assuming we agree it's not efficacious or not reliably efficacious, and because of the nature of the way it spreads in the air, and it's an awfully big expenditure of money and dubious expenditure of money, but what is the liberty threat to having this system as long as it really, and what are the concerns conservatives have about the data being collected? What's so bad about all this?
What business is it where you've been and what you've done? That is nobody's business.
Tracing your life.
That is right. It's all of a sudden you're now under a microscope where what you've done now in this time period is going to be in digital form forever, because things electronic are forever. They live forever. So you as an individual, once you decide what it will do, this will drive people away from going to be tested when they should, because they don't want to be tracked. So they won't have people getting tested like they should. They won't go. It's just like what happened. We had people that would not go to the hospital when they needed to because they were afraid they were going to, they were having heart attacks and not going to the hospital because they thought they were going to get the COVID, because the government had led them to believe if you get the COVID, you're going to die before the sun comes up.
Yep.
No matter who you are, no matter what your age is, no matter what your race is, that's what the government led people to believe, and so they wouldn't go take. So now we will have this with this tracing. People won't go get tested, and so my concern is the next thing is going to be mandatory testing, which will be a precursor to mandatory vaccines.
Yes. Right.
So it all links together. In this, and a great deal of this, I believe, has been with government seeing how much more can we suppress liberty and people still tolerate it. And unfortunately, I think they're finding that they can suppress liberty a fairly significant amount as long as they keep making people feel secure. It's kind of like how Khrushchev explained socialism. Do we have time for me to explain how he did that?
Go ahead.
He was talking to a group in a farmyard, and while he was talking, there was some chickens running around. So he reached down and he picked up one of the chickens and held it under his arm. And he kept talking, and he reached over and he started pulling the feathers out of the chicken. He's pulling them out one at a time, and he started pulling more out and more out. He's pulling them out by the handful. Chickens screaming and hollering and bleeding, but he's pulling them out, and he finally gets all of the feathers out of the chicken, and the chicken's just screaming and hollering. He sets it down on the ground. Then he goes over to the feed bag over there and grabs a handful of feed, walks over by the chicken and drops a little feed in front of it, and to feed the chicken, and then takes a couple of steps back and a little more. The next thing you know, he's got the chicken following him all the way across the barnyard as he gives him a little bit of food. No matter as bad as he treated that chicken, just treat him a little bit nice with some food, and he follows him anywhere. And that's kind of what our government's been doing to us, and they're just beating us up so that we'll feel real good when they stop beating us.
I will say, I think one of the repercussions, and you're alluding to it, one of the extreme repercussions of all of this is the change in the cultural expectation, the political climate, that what your relationship is to government. You assume I live in liberty, and if I want to be tested, I will. If I don't want to, I won't. But over time, and because of fear, and because of political pressure, and really societal pressure, there are people in our culture who are mocking and demanding about how other people behave. We kind of surrender the standard of liberty, the presumption of liberty, and it's our culture is being shifted over into, yeah, okay, we are a government-controlled society. As long as I do what I'm told, I'll be safe. And we seem to be going along with that. We don't have time to get into it, but I agree with your notion about the concern we have with the seeming pressure toward getting people to agree this is a horrible problem. We all have to. We have a whole new life. Life has changed forever, and we're going to get out of this by getting around ultimately to a vaccine, which flies in the face of, I mean, I've had on my show Dr. Robin Armstrong and Dr. Yvette Lozano, both of whom have treated COVID-19 patients and still are with complete success with hydroxychloroquine and a couple other things they add with it. The point being, it's curable with a medication presently available and not even expensive, but that is being suppressed too. Well, we need to do more time on this. I want to ask you one more question, because these friends of ours, our mutual friends who've been saying you got to get Senator Hall on, is what do you do as a Texan if you don't want to be part of this? How do you resist?
Well, I think we could, we just resist. And, you know, a few months ago, we had just about every county in Texas put together a resolution making their county or their city a Second Amendment sanctuary. I think we could do that for those liberty-loving cities and counties. So people get their city council and then their county commissioners to pass a resolution saying we will not participate
in contact tracing.
In contact tracing, and just said, you know, no, if you're going to do it, you're going to have to do it. We will not enforce it. We will not do it. And I think that's what we need to do with all of this other oppressive government rules that are coming down that are stifling our life, particularly this thing that I'm just learning about, the mask. Knowing that the facts are that wearing a mask for an extended period of time will deteriorate your health, it will deteriorate your immune system, and the single biggest factor that's coming out of who gets the COVID are people with a suppressed immune system. So we're now requiring, just like we're
suppressing their immune systems.
Well, just like we did when we told people to stay indoors.
Right.
We had caused the spread of the COVID by having people stay indoors, whereas if we'd allowed them to go outside and just getting a little bit of sunshine during the day, or if they were told them, you know, stay away from people, but stay out, it's okay to go outside, we would have probably had far fewer cases. And I'm just afraid we're coming up with rules that are counterproductive.
Okay, we need about another hour. I think we need about another hour. There's so many. I've been talking about this issue, of course, many times in my show, and had talked about experts and played clips from other experts talking about, and I was calling it house arrest for the healthy. You know, if there's something wrong with you, why are you forced to stay home? But we've been through that, and it's just become kind of the cultural expectation. Everyone goes along with this. Everyone agrees to this, even though doctors around the country have been saying, we're handling this all wrong. We shouldn't have done this to start with. We should be, as you say, protect the vulnerable, let the healthy live their lives. Government's job is to inform, not to keep you safe from disease. But it's been an amazing experiment in America's willingness to simply surrender. And I think for many people, it's just hard for them to imagine that the disease was so alarming at the beginning, or the reports of the disease were so alarming, and the numbers that people just surrendered to all of it. But I actually think there's much more waking up happening than the government might want. Think so?
I think you're absolutely right on that. And there's a lot more on this to talk about.
Okay, we'll have to do this again. Well,
okay.
I will be back to you.
I would love to.
Okay, folks, I want to hit two more very quick stories today. And I know Matt the Wonderful. Fortunately, I can't see him in there because it's dark in there, so he's probably giving me a look to let me know that it's about time to wrap it up. I do want to hit two other quick stories. One relates to John Bolton, and I'll just tell you there's a lawsuit that federal government, Department of Justice, has sued John Bolton, former National Security Advisor, to prevent him from releasing his book, or letting his book be released to the public. The White House is claiming that there's content in that book that is clearly information that John Bolton received because he was serving as National Security Advisor, just inappropriate, should never be released. And obviously, I will tell you, I used to really like John Bolton. I thought he had a lot of great arguments about foreign policy. He obviously got sideways with President Trump, and when President Trump let him go, relieved him of his National Security Advisor job, he seems to have not taken that well, and this is writing of a tell-all. And I would just say we'll have to hit the rest of the story another day, but what a sad fall from really kind of being a noble American hero in many ways, trying to get out to the public a book to essentially, obviously, try to hurt President Trump before the November 2020 elections, containing information that the Department of Justice is arguing is not permissible to be released. And this is John Bolton just deciding I'm going to get my licks in while I can. And it's just it's a very sad day. But my one only narrow point I want to make very clear is this: do not assume just because the Department of Justice decided to go to court against John Bolton to try to prevent the release of this book, do not assume there's some big dark secret that involves the Trump presidency, that there's some real clear wrongdoing that Bolton's finally going to tell the public about, but somehow he's being prevented. That does not at all necessarily flow. The idea, the standard, if you are a National Security Advisor, ought to be something like, you can't write any books about the presidency till 20 years later, 30 years later. You cannot be sharing America's secrets just because you're mad because the president let you go. But there's got to be some standard that just says that you can't conduct the presidency, you can't confide in a National Security Advisor if you are fearful that whatever you're saying is being recorded. I mean, it was poor President Trump, it has been all along, recorded, released to the public, leaked, and Bolton's book is already, as we speak, pieces being leaked to the media who are there and pouncing on it. But do not assume some great wrongdoing on the part of the president just because they had to go to court to stop John Bolton from releasing this book. And honestly, it may be a futile effort if I don't know, whoever is releasing it, whether it's Bolton or the publisher or other releasing it, may be a futile effort. But the idea to stand on the principle of saying we do not have National Security Advisors writing tell-alls after they leave office. One last extremely quick story, and that is, I just want to combine two stories very quickly to make this point. There was a lot of commentary, and we talked about a couple of days ago, about the idea that these massive riots, destruction of property, destruction of statues, all the looting that happened, the horrible conduct throughout our country following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, not related to the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. These are just Marxist elements who got inspired and they had a trigger and they went for it. But much of what was happening was being done by millennials who've been through our education system in this country. Really, we've had the leftist mindset, the anti-American, disdain for American values, disdain for the founding values of this country, disdain for the Christian faith, disdain for all that America stands for, has been taught to our young people, sadly, in the last 20, 30, maybe in 40 years, so that you have people who go through high school, college, grad school, and they actually emerge thinking they're educated and hating America, and thinking America is a country that is deeply racist, xenophobic, homophobic, intolerant, has a horrible history. And if you really thought that was true of America, if those were correct things to believe, then you would be angry at America, and you would think about maybe there's a need, I've got to stand up and fight this evil America. This is what's happened with our millennials. We have too many of them who actually think they're on the side of truth, on the side of righteousness and goodness, and it is a great fault of our education system. And so the second story, I'm going to tie these two together in a moment. The second story was polling done in battleground states, and 2-to-1 in battleground states, people are saying we need to halt immigration. We just should take a giant halt on immigration. Let America get back to work. Let us recover from this virus. Let us recover the employment numbers and let jobs go to Americans. I want to put those two together, and really this is wrapping up the show for this week to make this point. America needs a revival of the understanding of the idea of America. America needs a massive change in our education system so that young people starting in kindergarten and all the way through grad school get an honest picture of America's unique and extraordinary greatness, an honest understanding of what the founding fathers wrote first in the Declaration of Independence, the unique concept of the idea that you have rights from God simply because you were born, and that everyone has a right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. These are rights you have because you were born. This was unique in all of world history. The idea of the Declaration, and then the foundation of a government to protect those rights with the Constitution set up. That is what American history should start with. Never claiming American history is perfect. Obviously, the Constitution wasn't perfect. It contemplated slavery. It didn't allow women to vote. So we had changes. We've continued to make a better union, a better union, a better union. We're working to make America better all the time. But we need to have an America where people learn its unique greatness, and the unique greatness of our history and our foreign policy and our leadership in the world in celebrating freedom and defending freedom and speaking up for freedom. America has a precious story that should be told again, started over in our education system, so that we don't have 54% of millennials, or whatever it is, who think that socialism might be a better idea than freedom. So we don't have numbers of millennials who actually justify desecrating statues of good Americans in history because we have an evil, horrible, bad country with a bad history, and that deserves to be destroyed. We need to reset and understand the idea of America. And part of our problem in this country, with massive numbers of people coming to America, many illegally, some legally, we have a whole a mass of Americans of people living within the confines of our geography, not necessarily American citizens, who also have no appreciation of the unique and extraordinary greatness of America. Taking a big giant pause in immigration, saying, you know what, we need to recenter our country around understanding why America became the most prosperous, the best, the most noble and freest country on earth. Not perfect, not claiming every step of American history was perfect, not claiming every foreign policy decision was perfect, but the idea of America needs to be reinvigorated in the hearts and minds of students around this country, and it would help a lot to stop bringing in other people for a while. Stop bringing in other people who themselves, as adults, don't necessarily understand America's unique and extraordinary greatness. It would be a great thing for President Trump to include in his re-election campaign this idea of taking a pause on immigration. And by the way, same poll in swing states, 2-1, those people said, and we absolutely not should just unqualified grant citizenship to everyone who's here illegally. We cannot just say, okay, reset, everyone's legal, now we start over. There is an awakening happening in the American people that we need to have a concept of American citizenship, the identity of America, the unique meaning of America has to be reinstated in our people. President Trump, I believe, has done a tremendous job inspiring that thought in America, and that is going to be among the central issues we're talking about in the 2020 elections, is the very identity of America. And now, my friends, as I always do at the close of every show, I want to talk with you about why the stories we talked about today matter to you. And we started out today talking about contact tracing, selective, ineffective surveillance, and why it matters to you. Physicians say contact tracing doesn't work for STDs. Disease is spread by physical contact. But for airborne contagion, effective contact tracing is essentially impossible. Contact tracing programs said by politicians to be voluntary, but without 100% participation, how can they possibly be effective? New York City Mayor de Blasio says tracers cannot even ask whether a person who has tested positive was present at riots and protests, places of mass gathering, and no social distancing. Makes a complete farce out of tracing program as a serious preventative measure. Americans must pressure officials to end contact tracing programs. They're ineffective as to public health, and it's a massive move toward more of a surveillance state. And on the Bolton book battle, public servants cashing in on tell-all books are inherently off-putting to Americans. Certain government positions, especially the National Security Advisor to the President, ought to be banned from book writing for 20 years after service, if not permanently. Presidents deserve staff support from people giving their best advice, not angling to undermine the president if advice is not followed, especially as to national security. Bolton has been a conservative hero. He now appears to be just another swamp hack, determined to help take down Trump because Trump bruised his ego. D.C. judges are likely to follow swamp law, which is that all decisions must go against Trump. Maybe the book will be damaging to Trump, but doubtful, because I think Americans see the swamp game and they're fed up with everyone playing it. And finally, Anti-Americanism and Immigration and why it matters to you. Statue desecration and destruction and riots should not be surprising. Decades of leftist indoctrination have taught hatred of America. If America is deserving of hate, why wouldn't statues be targets? And why wouldn't riots be appropriate? America is not deserving of hate. Now is the time to relearn American exceptionalism. Polls support a pause in immigration. Let unemployed Americans get the first crack at reopening jobs. Let's get America's house back in order first. More immigrants later. And that, my friends, is America Can We Talk for today. Thank you so much for tuning in every Monday through Thursday, 3 p.m. Central Time, to America Can We Talk, where I always talk truth about America, because America matters. And I'll talk to you next time.
America Can We Talk? Truth about America.
Can you